All right, so today's class, we're going to finish up our topic on succession and change in ecosystems. So last class, we had talked about primary succession, we had talked about pioneer species, and we had also talked about secondary succession. So just for a quick review, pioneer species, those are the species that are the first to arrive at a location, such as lichen and moss. Those would be pioneer species. So when we're talking about primary succession, this is occurring in an area that was previously bare, such as rock. There was no life there before. All right, so there was no life there before because there was no soil. So examples of primary succession was on like volcanic islands, rocks that are left behind by retreating glaciers, and so on. So that's a quick review of primary succession and pioneer species. And then eventually we get to this climax community, which is a stable community. And we see lots of diversity here, lots of different species here. And that climax community can then exist for many, many years. And then comparing that to a secondary succession, this is where life was there before, and then a community was destroyed by, for example, human activities or some sort of natural occurrence like a burned forest or flooding or so on, but it could also be human activities like deforestation or something like that. But life did exist there before. And this was just an example of secondary succession occurring here. So life did exist before, but there was some sort of activity. So here maybe it was a forest fire, but soil is still there, and then we'll have new growth, and then eventually a climax and community again. Okay, and so continuing with our topic of change in ecosystems and changes caused by human activities. So we'll start by talking about pest control and pesticides. So pesticides are used to kill pests, but at the same time, they can also harm other organisms. And maybe there are other beneficial organisms that are living in the same environment. So for example, the lygus bug is a pest. It feeds on alfalfa and canola plants. So pests, those are the pests. And pesticides are used to kill the lygus bug, but at the same time, it's also killing off the bees. The bees are beneficial because they are pollinators. So pesticides can also kill the beneficial insects that are maybe also preying on the pests. So that can eventually result in the pest populations actually increasing. Biological control is a method of controlling insect pests by using their natural enemies. So for example, there's a black dot spurge beetle. So there's this plant, it's called the leafy spurge. It's a weed, and it grows faster than naturally occurring pasture grasses. It was actually brought into Canada in the 1800s by accident. And cattle, they do not eat this leafy spurge. So there's this black dot beetle that eats the leafy spurge, and this beetle was introduced into Alberta in 1983, and it has been successful in controlling the spread of this leafy spurge weed. But there are many risks whenever a new organism, when it's brought into a new ecosystem, because it's not native to the area, and therefore it doesn't have any natural enemies. So it is taking a risk because it can start dominating over the other species. So like I said, there can be risks to introduced species. So introduced species, these are species that are introduced into an environment where they're not naturally found. You may also see them called exotic species. So these species, they occur naturally in another part of the world, and because they are well established in that ecosystem, they are going to be controlled by predators and other natural resources there. All right, so if this introduced species is brought to a new area, if it's able to survive and reproduce better than the naturally occurring species, they are going to become invasive and they can take over the ecosystem. So these are some examples from the textbook on page 63. The zebra mussels, the European starlings, the Scotch broom plant, and the purple loose strife plant in Alberta. All right, so we're just going to watch a couple of videos here on invasive species and the threat of invasive species.
Rapidly growing, consuming, adapting, they conquer. Jeopardizing local economies, threatening human health, and devastating entire ecosystems.
As whole rows of cherished landmarks are condemned, brought home to town-dwelling citizens are the rigid precautions being taken by the Department of Agriculture to save this tree from extinction.
Invasive species are non-native organisms that cause considerable damage when introduced to a new area. These species compete with native wildlife for resources and thrive at the expense of the local ecosystem. The introduction of invasive species is often associated with human activity. Boats that travel between different bodies of water can carry hitchhikers, such as the zebra mussel. One of the most notorious invasive species in the United States, these rapidly reproducing mussels clog pipes and overtake beaches in the Great Lakes. Some invasive species, however, are introduced intentionally. In the early 20th century, cane toads were brought to Australia as a form of pest control. Today, these poisonous amphibians number in the millions and have caused a decline in native predators on the island. It's not just animals. Bacteria, fungi, and plants can also become invasive. Brought to South Africa in the 19th century, the black wattle is an invasive tree often used for timber and firewood. This beautiful tree and other thirsty invasives are depleting the country's already record-low water supply. Because of their impact on human health, ecosystems, and infrastructure, invasive species cost the global economy over $1 trillion each year. Many measures can be taken to help limit the spread of invasive species, but the most effective method is prevention. By carefully cleaning boats before transferring between different bodies of water, not releasing exotic pets into the wild, and planting gardens with native species, we can help prevent the spread of invasive organisms. Every living thing has evolved to play a specialized role within their ecosystem. In the ultimate balancing act, even one invasive species can drastically tilt the scales. If we stay mindful of our role in the spread of these organisms, we can prevent invasions before it is too late.
Massive vines that blanket the southern United States, climbing as high as 100 feet as they uproot trees and swallow buildings. A ravenous snake that is capable of devouring an alligator. Rabbit populations that eat themselves into starvation. These aren't horror movie concepts, they're real stories. But how could such situations exist in nature? All three are examples of invasive species. Organisms harmful not because of what they are, but where they happen to be. The kudzu vine, for example, had grown quietly in its native East Asia, eaten by various insects and dying off during the cold winters. But its fortunes changed when it was imported into the southeastern United States for porch decoration and cattle feed. Its planting was even subsidized by the government to fight soil erosion. With sunny fields, a mild climate, and no natural predators in its new home, the vine grew uncontrollably until it became known as the plant that ate the South. Meanwhile, in Florida's Everglades, Burmese pythons, thought to have been released by pet owners, are the cause of decreasing populations of organisms. They're successfully outcompeting top predators, such as the alligator and panther, causing a significant reduction in their food sources. They're not a problem in their native Asia because diseases, parasites, and predators help to control their population size. And in Australia, European rabbits eat so many plants that they wipe out the food supply for themselves and other herbivores. They're a pretty recent addition, intentionally introduced to the continent because one man enjoyed hunting them. Like the Burmese pythons, various factors in their native habitat keep their numbers in control. But in Australia, the lack of predators and a climate perfect for year-long reproduction allows their populations to skyrocket. So why does this keep happening? Most of the world's ecosystems are the result of millennia of co-evolution by organisms, adapting to their environment and each other until a stable balance is reached. Healthy ecosystems maintain this balance via limiting factors, environmental conditions that restrict the size or range of a species. These include things like natural geography and climate, food availability, and the presence or absence of predators. For example, plant growth depends on levels of sunlight and soil nutrients. The amount of edible plants affects the population of herbivores, which in turn impacts the carnivores that feed on them. And a healthy predator population keeps the herbivores from becoming too numerous and devouring all the plants. But even minor changes in one factor can upset this balance, and the sudden introduction of non-native organisms can be a pretty major change. A species that is evolved in a separate habitat will be susceptible to different limiting factors, different predators, different energy sources, and different climates. If the new habitat's limiting factors fail to restrict the species' growth, it will continue to multiply, outcompeting native organisms for resources and disrupting the entire ecosystem. Species are sometimes introduced into new habitats through natural factors like storms, ocean currents, or climate shifts. The majority of invasive species, though, are introduced by humans. Often this happens unintentionally, as when the zebra mussel was accidentally brought to Lake Erie by cargo ships. But as people migrate around the world, we have also deliberately brought our plants and animals along, rarely considering the consequences. But now that we're learning more about the effects of invasive species on ecosystems, many governments closely monitor the transport of plants and animals and ban the imports of certain organisms. But could the species with the most drastic environmental impact be a group of primates who emerged from Africa to cover most of the world? Are we an invasive species?
Okay, so next we are looking at species in danger. So when we talk about a species that has gone extinct, that means that species no longer exists anywhere in the world. And habitat loss is the main reason why so many species are threatened with extinction. Like we talked about introduced species or invasive species, that's another reason. Pollution, changes in climate, overhunting and overfishing, those are all other reasons why species are threatened or endangered. So when we say threatened, that means species whose numbers are declining. Endangered, these are organisms that are so rare that they are in serious danger of becoming extinct. And lastly is extirpated. This is a local extinction, meaning a species no longer exists in a particular area, but they still exist elsewhere in the world. All right, so here in this image here, we're just looking at some species that are extinct, that are endangered, and that are threatened. This is a figure from the textbook. So for example, species that are extinct, they are no longer found anywhere in the world. So these are some examples of those. Endangered, like I said, they are very, very rare, that they are in serious danger of becoming extinct. And then threatened, that just means species whose numbers are starting to decline. All right, so this again is in the textbook. Okay, so the homework for today, it won't be the textbook questions. The homework for today is the worksheet on changes caused by human activity, and this will be found in the modules.